This video was brought to you by Incogni. In the UK over the past week, we've seen a huge number of news stories about the Chancellor Rachel Reeves' spring statement, with endless references to her so-called fiscal rules, which are apparently hemming the government in and forcing them to make unpopular decisions. At first glance, this can all sound a bit weird. After all, fiscal rules are set by the government, so if they're forcing them to do unpopular things, why doesn't the government just scrap them? So in this video, we thought we'd explain what Reeves' fiscal rules actually are, why she's so wed to them, and whether they're actually a good idea. Who's more influential, Keir Starmer or Mr. Beast? Well, we asked the TLDR team and audience to rank a bunch of the most powerful people, and we have the results. Find out the full list in the next copy of our magazine, Too Long. And you can pre-order a copy by clicking the link in the description. Let's start with a quick intro to fiscal rules. Since 1990, most OECD governments have used fiscal rules to both measure their own fiscal performance and, more importantly, to convince markets that they can be trusted, in the hope that this will mean lower borrowing costs. In the UK, fiscal rules were first adopted in 1997 by the new Labour government, and since then, the UK has had 10 different sets of fiscal rules under various chancellors. As you can see, the two most common fiscal rules are to get debt as a share of GDP falling by a specific year, and more recently, a welfare cap. This debt as a share of GDP rule is motivated by the fact that a falling debt to GDP ratio suggests that a country is producing enough goods and services to comfortably handle its debts. Conversely, a rising debt to GDP ratio, which is what the UK has had recently, indicates that it's struggling to generate enough economic activity to repay its debts. This problem becomes particularly acute when a country's overall debt to GDP ratio becomes bigger, both because this increases the debt servicing costs, i.e. the cost of paying off the interest on this debt, and because there's a higher risk of default. Anyway, this is why most governments have aimed to get the debt to GDP ratio falling by the end of Parliament. Anyway, the other rule, a welfare cap, is popular with governments both because welfare caps are popular with most of the electorate, and because they give governments a politically easy way to resist increases in welfare spending. Anyway, when it comes to Reeves, she has 3 fiscal rules, including variants of both of the 2 we've already discussed. Specifically, Reeves' fiscal rules are the stability rule, i.e. maintain a balanced budget by ensuring that day-to-day spending, or money leaving the treasury, is met by revenues, or money coming in. The investment rule, i.e. to reduce the UK's debt to GDP ratio by the end of Parliament, although Reeves is using a slightly unorthodox measure of debt. And the welfare cap, i.e. to limit government spending on welfare. But it's really the first 2 rules that are restricting the government's room for manoeuvre at the moment, and to understand why, you'll need to know a bit more detail about both of them. Let's start with Reeves' stability rule, which requires that by 2028-29, day-to-day spending should be met by revenues, so that after this point, the government is only borrowing money for investment, and not to fund spending. Reeves' rule here differs from that of previous chancellors in that she's given herself a stricter 3-year timeline instead of the usual 5-year timeline, which makes things slightly more difficult for her because it's harder for her to include hypothetical future tax and spending plans that were never going to happen anyway, but would help her meet this target. And doing this is pretty common. Since the Office for Budget Responsibility, the body responsible for monitoring government's adherence to their fiscal rules, was created in 2010, for instance, every chancellor has promised and failed to raise fuel duty, in large part because it makes the OBR's forecast just look more optimistic. Anyway, at the last budget in late 2024, the OBR estimated that the government was on track to meet this commitment, but only just. Specifically, the OBR forecast that on the government's original spending plans, in 2029-2030, the government would take in $9.9 billion more in taxes than it would spend on day-to-day expenditures. And this is what the commentators are referring to when they talk about the Chancellor's $9.9 billion in headroom. Reeves' investment rule also creates another headroom, though. This rule requires that public debt, newly defined under the Labour government as public sector net financial liabilities, or PSNUFL, falls relative to GDP in 2029-2030. As we explained in a previous video, PSNUFL is a broader than usual definition of debt that includes more financial liabilities on the government's balance sheet, like funded pension schemes, but also more assets, like equity stakes in private companies and student loans. Using PSNUFL means that the government's debt takes into account the rising value of any equity stakes or investment that borrowed money is used for. For instance, if the government borrows money and invests it via GB Energy into a wind farm whose value then doubles, this will be accounted for in Reeves's investment rule. This rule also enables the government to spend on investment that will bring long-term benefits, rather than making cuts to investment budgets to satisfy short-term fiscal rules, as happened under Chancellors Hunt and Sunak. Anyway, when the budget was announced, the OBR estimated that this second rule created £16.9 billion in headroom, which means that it's really the first rule which is making things difficult for Reeves. Now, this smaller £9.9 billion headroom was already pretty tight. Historically, chancellors have usually left something more like £20 billion in headroom to account for any surprise spending increases or revenue shortfalls. However, things became markedly more difficult early this month, when the OBR, which produces forecasts every 6 months, announced that in its latest forecasts, the headroom the Chancellor had 6 months ago when she announced the budget had since evaporated, and the government was actually on track to run a spending deficit of £4.1 billion in 2029-2030. This is for a variety of reasons, including weaker than expected GDP growth, which means lower tax revenues, and higher than expected spending, in part due to an increase in benefit claimants. This is why Reeves, who had previously said that she only wanted to do one budget a year, was forced into some last-minute spending cuts last week, mostly targeted at welfare. Nonetheless, this last-minute fiddling of spending plans has got people asking whether Reeves's rigid adherence to her fiscal rules is actually prudent. For starters, it does look like her fiscal rules are just too tight. As Bloomberg reports, Reeves's margins are the third smallest since 2010, meaning that she doesn't have much wiggle room, which limits her ability to respond to sudden crises, like, say, a Trump trade war, and even forces her to react to even slight changes in OBR forecasts, which, by the way, are wildly uncertain. After all, no one can predict the economic situation next year, let alone in 2029-2030. Now, while Reeves would say that adhering to her fiscal rules is the only way to maintain credibility and guarantee fiscal certainty, if your fiscal rules are forcing you to change your spending plans every 6 months, there's at least an argument to be made that they're making things less, not more certain. Now, as we've demonstrated in this video, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in the world about politics and current affairs, often with few easy solutions. Unfortunately, this can be the case online too. There are all kinds of bad actors out there that want to try and use you to make a quick buck. Take, for instance, data brokers. They sell your data to businesses and marketing agencies, leading to more spam calls, texts, and emails. Or even worse, they can sell your data to even worse actors, who can go on to use your identity. Some data brokers have even been charged with conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud for internationally supplying data lists of elderly and vulnerable people to scammers. Fortunately, today's sponsor Incogni can help to rectify this. They work on your behalf to request your personal data removal. They also deal with any objections, and to make sure that your personal information isn't just shared by the brokers again, they conduct repeated removal requests. And with their family and friends plan, they'll even do this for you and up to 3 of, well, your friends and family. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, if you use our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. So thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.